So here with this issue of the Chinese participating in anti-piracy activities, it's extending on its relationship with Africa beyond the economic into the political. Good or bad?
Well, a couple of things, Lerato. Firstly is, linking what you said earlier, firstly there was talks announced a couple of weeks ago that one of China's leading airlines, HNA, Hainan Airlines, is in talks of Air Zimbabwe with a view to taking over the airline.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a move away from traditional resources, energy, oil into Africa, starting to into services, airlines as well. In the Seychelles case, certainly we're seeing increased Chinese trade activity through the likes of Mauritius, particularly setting up a special economic zone in Mauritius, manufacturing zone of Chinese manufacturers in Mauritius. Now you mentioned Seychelles for sort of geo-strategic concerns around shipping and obviously anti-piracy issues. So undoubtedly China's making inroads into what has traditionally been India's sort of political sphere of influence, and that is Indian Ocean Rim.
I mean, when we talk about BRICS, Brazil, Russia, China and India, and South Africa joined that emerging market bloc this year, the concerns were ideologically, South Africa is more aligned to India. And when you look at these multilateral formations, it can't just be a relationship predicated on economic opportunities. There's got to be some kind of synergy of values. And many African states, when they talk democracy, that almost flies in the face of what China represents. Do we need to see a greater political role for China in Africa? And does that mean we need to be affirming new values and standards?
I think there's two issues. Firstly, yes, you're right in alluding to do South Africa and India have a more common starting position than South Africa and China? Yes, there's the language factor, there's the Indian diaspora in South Africa, there's a traditional common colonial partner, there's a similar legal system, there's a somewhat similar political system as well. So one would think by default South Africa and China are more natural allies. However, over the course of the last 10, 11 years or so, since SA established diplomatic relations of China in 1998 January, so it's 13 years now. We see that China truly has become South Africa's more closer strategic partner, I would argue, based on political interests, multilaterally, based on South Africa almost as being a major economic political player in the continent and the go-to country, the go-to government in Africa for the Chinese. So I think undoubtedly, for our government, Pretoria sees Beijing almost as a partner for collaboration in Africa, which effectively is increasingly where there's areas for collaboration, considering we're the two biggest actors, the South Africans and the Chinese.
Increasingly, as these relationships get deeper, civil society is calling for the relationship to be predicated on a different system of norms and standards. You think of the whole debacle around the Dalai Lama and the visa. And there is a sense that the relationship can't just purely be economic. And what that particular example demonstrated was that China, being the major investor, is the power broker. The people with the power here are not the Africans, it's the Chinese.
Well, that's one argument. Undoubtedly, I think our government adopts a very realist position and recognises the fact that, yes, China's the largest trading partner, the single largest trading partner of Africa, the largest investor, by some counts, private investor, certainly capital deployer in terms of concessional finance around infrastructure and the like. It's the largest financier of that infrastructure, and it's also the largest lender to African governments. So a realist would say, which our government is adopting a very realist position, realpolitik ultimately, how do we engage or align and perhaps start to, at the very least, discuss our common mutual interests in the context of Africa? Is it values-based? Is foreign policy ever values-based? Are foreign relations? I think interests predominate over supposed values, and I think this applies not just to ourselves, but I think the majority of countries in the global
Let's look at that economic relationship and chip away at it in small blocks. We're seeing volatility globally. We're seeing factory figures shrinking in Europe, Germany, the latest. We're seeing GDP slow in China. We're seeing house prices decline in China. And people are starting to say that's the beginning of the slowdown in China. And if it's the beginning of the slowdown in China, it's the beginning of less demand for African goods. Is the world system under threat? And is this Chinese dragon not quite the dragon anymore? Are we under danger?
No, I don't think so. I think comments about will China have a hard landing or a soft landing, that's the sort of common sort of question posed, is irresponsible. China's growth undoubtedly is slowing, but from unsustainable inflationary highs of double digits in recent years, we're coming to the end of the stimulus package spend from Q1 2009, infrastructure spend in China, which effectively rescued the global economy. That's what the Chinese government did from Beijing's perspective. We're seeing policymakers in Beijing, I think, have resigned themselves to a more 7.5%, 8% sort of growth band. Sustainable, I would argue, for at least another decade or so. So, yes, you're right in alluding that China's growth has underpinned African growth, generally speaking, from a commodity sort of super cycle, and we're supplying those commodities prices remain high. This underpins African growth ultimately. I think we shouldn't be overly concerned. I think certain African governments, economies have taken conscious decisions to strategically align vis-a-vis the Chinese growth phenomenon. There will be no more China. One thing I think point to note is our economy, we're misfiring at 1.3, 1.4%. Right. Australia is the only Western, or dare I say, developed economy that is getting double our growth. Why? Right. Because of the alignment to this Chinese resource commodities play. If Australia is doing it in a realpolitik, a real economic sort of perspective, why can't we in South Africa?
Again, with the slowdown in China, what does it mean for China's investment strategy? As you alluded to earlier on, we've seen the Chinese very active in the extractive resources space. That could be changing a little bit, but how much of a change? Because, you know, we're starting, like you said, China could be bidding for Air Zimbabwe. We've seen China very involved in infrastructure builds in countries like Angola, Ethiopia, and also Kenya. We're seeing China coming up with a development fund for Africa targeting SMEs. Will any of these projects be impacted in the new year?
I think if we look at the last decade has been largely an energy play, increasingly a solid minerals play. But the bulk of Chinese finance coming to Africa goes into the power sector. Something like 55 to 60% of most Chinese finance through the China's Exim Bank, through China Development Bank, so-called policy banks, i.e. Foreign policy aligned, if you will, Chinese finance to the continent is coming to a very enabling infrastructure. And that's ultimately, hopefully, laying a foundation for increased private sector development and long-term sustainable growth beyond just a commodities play. Chinese government, again, because of the nature of the Chinese political economy, most of these plans or these strategies are government concocted, if you will, and business steps into that sort of strategy. Right. Very unlike the India position. So currently setting up special economic zones, manufacturing zones in various African economies. So it's starting to diversify and becoming more pervasive and also deepening.